and we'll just go with the flow. Talk to me about your grandfather. What do you remember about your grandfather?
He was a very kind man, very understanding. He spoke very, very little English, spoke 99% of the time in Yiddish. He was very ethical in his dealings with the mills, the steel mills, particularly with companies like Atlas Steels. He, in Welland, he never really could sign his name. His only way of signing his name was really primarily with the X. But his word was his bond. There was never anybody that spoke ill of him. He was a very philanthropic individual, helping people without even being asked to help. He was a great believer in his religion. He was very, very active in the Beth Jacob Synagogue, which ironically was not named after him, by the way. And he was president, for as long as I can remember. His children respected him to the nth degree. They would never cross him. If there ever was a decision to be made, his decision would always be final. I remember one particular episode pertaining to me, that when I was going to school in London, Ontario, I must have been about 18 or 19, I imagine, and I wanted a car. At that time, the company was called Takafman and Goldblatt, and they were both brother-in-laws. And when I wanted a car, I went to my dad, and my dad said, "You'll have to talk to Zeta, and also you'd have to talk to Uncle Rube, who was in the family business, who, by the way, was Mother's brother." And when I went to my grandfather, I said to him, "Zeta, I'd like to have a car." And he said, "Do you really need it?" And I said, "Yes." He said, "Okay," but he said, "I'd like you to talk to Uncle Rube." I went to my Uncle Rube, and I said, "I want to get a car, and by the way, the company paid for it. That's why I went through this procedure." And the first thing he said, "Did Yankee okay it?" That was my grandfather's name by Rube. And I said, "Yes." He says, "Okay." And that's how I got my first car.
How did he conduct business? If he only spoke Yiddish, how was he able to do all that business?
Well, he was very lucky because his two sons, particularly George and my dad, were involved in it, and then Uncle Rube. And they were the ones that really conducted the day-to-day business, but they always kept him up to date what was going on. And he only came into play when they first started off, when these people were coming into the business. And like I say, the steel mills had an awful lot of respect for him, because they knew, even though he wasn't able to read English, etc., they knew that his word was his bond, and this was carried on to his children. He used to love to play pinochle. He smoked cigarettes, sweet capital, like crazy. I bet he used to smoke 3 or 4 packs a day.
Did he have a cigarette holder?
He had a cigarette holder.
So was he an elegant man?
Yeah, very well groomed, He had a beard similar to mine with a mustache, always smoked, never rode on the Sabbath. I remember comes Friday night and Saturday morning, he always walked to shul. He never, pardon?
Did he live next door to you?
No, he lived on Robert Street. He lived next door to the office, the original office. He lived, our family home, mother and dad's home, was on John Street, which was a block and a half away. He used to get a shave every Saturday night. If I'm not mistaken, a shave was a quarter in those days. I remember I used to go with him periodically, and he used to give the barber, whose name I remember now, Sid Monk, a 10-cent tip. He was a very kind and courteous man. I don't think he ever really lost his temper. And like I say, he was very generous, not only to his family, but to the Jewish community. There are many stories about him. In fact, Sam Taylor in Hamilton was over to see me about 2 or 3 months ago. And he came just to tell me the story that how my grandfather walked by their store and heard they needed money, and on his own volition went in and loaned his mother some money, never got a note, and said, "You can pay me back when you have the money," and never charged interest to anybody.
What was this? Can you tell the story about the time he was being chauffeured to Niagara Falls and he saw a woman on her front lawn and she had been evicted?
Well, I don't recall that, but it certainly was typical of the acts and the deeds that he did.
His personality was similar to Dee Dee's. He was quiet.
Yeah, very similar to Dee Dee's.
Yeah.
He was a very quiet man. Always had the holiday celebrations at his home. His particular daughter, Hilda, who never married, was like his slave without being that. I mean, she looked after him unbelievably well. We always celebrated the Jewish holidays, Passover, the Shabbos, Yom Kippur fast, etc. at his house. And he was the patriarch. Whatever he said went, and none of his children would ever deem to do anything contrary to what he wanted to be done.
Do you remember how old you were when he died?
He must have died, I think, when
1944?
Well, I think I may have been in university at that time. Yeah, that's why I got the car, because I was going to school in London, and that was one of my reasons why I needed a car.
Do you remember the funeral?
Not really. It was well attended, I'm sure. I don't recall it, don't ask me why not, but I'm sure it was well attended by not only Jewish people, by a lot of Christian people who had been helped by him or who were impressed with his generosity and with his ethics, etc.
Do you recall, did you ever know?
Oh, I must tell you another interesting story about that. That when I first went to work for the company, it must have been in 44. I got kicked out of the university in about 44, and I went to work for the company. And one of my first jobs, responsibilities I should say, was to pick up a freshly laid egg. At that time, my grandfather had cancer. I think it was prostate cancer, I think it was. And the cure at that time that was going around was that if you got a freshly laid egg and brought it within the hour and give it to a person that had the cancer. In his case, the grandfather, it was supposed to help cure the disease. So one of my duties was to go every day. There was a farm or a chicken hatchery in Burlington, and they would call up when an egg was freshly laid, and I had to go to pick it up. And I did this for 3 or 4 times, and I'll never forget one particular day. I used to go about noontime. I went to my dad and I says, Dad, you know, really, I'm too important to go to pick up the egg. Why don't you get one of the drivers? And I'll never forget, my dad looked at me and he says, you know, Marvin, you've got a good point. And he says, come with me. And we go in and we get into the car. We drive to where it was, pick up the egg and back. And I'll never forget, the moral of that story was, here I was, a young fisher, saying I was too important to go for the egg, and yet my dad turned around and took me there. So that was just a sideline.
Did you ever know your grandmother, his wife, or did she die before you were born?
No, she died before I was born.
And what about Bubby's father?
I remember him faintly. He also was an elegant-looking man, taller than grandfather Goldblatt was. He also, ironically, was in the scrap business, but in his own company. And I never knew him too well. He was a very elegant man. I understand he had quite a few wives. And that's about all I can remember about him.
Were you ever told when you were growing up that you took after him?
Not that I recall.
Tell me a bit about your Uncle Ruby.
Tell you a little bit about my Uncle Ruby. I think we had a relationship, was love and hate. He was different than my dad and different than my Uncle George in that he was more forceful in explaining or running things. He was in charge of the scrap yard. I'll never forget a particular episode that I was working in the yard, and I must have been 17, 18 years old, and I was working in the summertime. It was very hot in the scrap yard, and I'll never forget, I got the men together and I said, you people are stupid. Look at my father works. He sits in an air-conditioned office, and look at how hard you people work, etc., etc. And my Uncle Rube found out about it, and I think I was fired within 2 hours. I was barred from the yard for quite a while. I guess that's all I can basically remember about Uncle Rube.
How did that work? There was Frank and George and Ruby and
Yeah.
Morley?
Morley, yeah. Morley was younger. It was surprisingly, I don't recall them ever having a serious disagreement. They all recognize that Dad was the boss. I'm excluding the grandfather now because he was like the patriarch. And whatever Dad said was always carried out. I don't recall them ever having any serious disagreements. And considering they were brother-in-laws, the relationship, I think, was very harmonious.
Can you tell me about your Uncle George? What kind of a man was he?
And George also was a very remarkable man. He also was very ethical. He acknowledged Dad's position, and Dad never, of course, flaunted it. It was never necessary. George was an extremely kind and gentle person. I'll never forget that. Again, when I was young, I went gambling one night, and I lost quite a bit of money in those days. And I had to pay the guy the next day. And I think the amount of money that I lost was about $2,000. And in those days, there was a lot of money. And I didn't have it. I went to my Uncle George and I said, Uncle George, I'm in big trouble. I don't want to go to my dad. I need $2,000. And he says, what for? And I told him. And he said, did you learn your lesson? I says, yep. He gave me the money, and he never mentioned it to my dad. He never asked to be paid back, and I don't think I ever offered to pay him back for some crazy reason. But I never forgot his generosity, and I've tried to reciprocate his kindness to me with being helpful and cooperative with his son Larry.
I heard that Frank and George were exceptionally close.
Yeah, they were very, very close. They were an unusual family. I think they all were close. Morley was a little bit more distant. I think Morley was the youngest. And there was another uncle, by the way, Benny, who was quite ill. I think he had Parkinson's disease, that they looked after him. But Dad and George were very close. I don't think they ever really had an argument.
And Mossy and Hilda, can you just say a few words about them?
Yeah, well, Mossy was the oldest sister. She was married to Charlie Levinson, who had a shoe store. The one that was mostly connected with me in a way was Aunt Hilda, who, like I said before, lived with the grandfather, devoted her whole life to him, never got married. Not that she didn't have an opportunity. She was a very attractive woman in her own way, but exceptionally devoted to the father, and she really gave her life for him.
How come, in what way were you closer to her than to Mossy?
Well, because Mossy was married and had a family, and then naturally her time was spent with her family, and I wasn't really that close to Hilda because she was very partial to Mossy's kids, George and Martin Levinson. But that still didn't make any difference because I think I respected subconsciously her devotion to the father.
And I also remember Dee Dee used to visit Hilda religiously when they got older.
Oh yeah, when Hilda was sick, when after the grandfather died, Hilda was not well. The family was very close-knit. She moved into an apartment, and naturally she was supported by the brothers without any question, and Dad would visit her, I would bet you, now that we're talking this way, damn near every day. Used to go at lunchtime.
What about, what was wrong with Morley's leg?
I don't know. You should ask Malcolm if he remembers. I don't know. Bubby would remember. I don't know if it was at birth or what. Or he had a bad fall. I'm not quite sure.
So was Morley kind of on the outside a little bit?
I got to be careful how I answer that.
Well, this is, You can answer it any way you want because I won't use
Yeah.
everything.
Well, Morley always classified himself as an intellectual.
Yeah.
He classified himself also as a philosopher. He didn't have the street smarts that Dad had. He wasn't really fond of the scrap business. He formed his own company, owned by the brothers, by the way, to International Machinery Company. And that was it. He wasn't close in any way as Dad and George were. And I think that closeness was even not with their grandfather and Hilda, for whatever the reason may be.
Okay, let's talk about. Do you want to eat lunch?
No.
All right, let's shift a little bit. We'll get back to Dee Dee. Let's talk about Bubby a bit. What was it like growing up in your family with Bubby as a mother? Was your father around a lot, or were you in charge a lot of the time? And what was that whole family life like in the house?
I'll put it this way here. Dad, like I said, Dad would work 7 days a week. He loved the business. And naturally, he didn't spend that much time with us. With one exception, he used to take me to the wrestling matches. He used to love the wrestling matches. And football. We used to go to the football games nearly every Saturday. That was the time when my Uncle Benny, Dad's brother, was ill, had Parkinson's. And they used to play football at the AAA grounds. And because of the uncle's condition, we had a pass to drive in. So we used to go to the football games all the time, every Saturday. We used to go to wrestling matches. Dad loved the wrestling matches. Dad traveled a lot in the States in his business.
So, what was it hard on Bubby raising you 3 kids by yourself?
I don't really think so. I think in those days it was the accepted practice. The husband would work,
Yeah.
and the woman stayed home and looked after the house. We always had help in the house.
Did she yell a lot when you were growing up?
I don't think any more than a normal mother would yell at her kids, to be honest with you.
Yeah.
We used to have a house at the beach. We used to rent it. Dad hated the beach.
What beach was that?
Beg your pardon? Hamilton Beach, Burlington Beach. I know Dad was very fastidious. And by the way, he won the award of one of the 10 best dressed men in Canada.
He didn't like the beach because he'd get dirty?
Yeah, he liked that. In fact, he would never even take a bath there. When he would come on the weekends, he used to always go home Saturday afternoon to take a bath in the house in Hamilton. Never liked eating outside, can't stand the flies, couldn't stand the flies. Loved to play gin rummy. They used to go to Florida every year for 2 weeks, maybe at the most a month. He was very friendly at that time with Nate Adler, of blessed memory. And they would go as a couple. And Dad and Nate would play gin rummy. As Dad got older in the office, we had a friend of his, Barney Hirschman, who would play gin with Dad every day, usually 3 o'clock or 4 o'clock in the afternoon. He loved his gin rummy. When he used to go to Miami, he used to like to bet the horses. He was a good gambler. Loved to buy ties and cufflinks. He had a favorite spot at the Roney Plaza Hotel in Miami at that time, and would buy things there. Always shopped at Sulca's in New York for his ties and shirts. When we used to go to Europe together, he would walk into Sulca's in Paris and come outside in the daylight when he was buying ties, and he could spend an hour, at least an hour when he was shopping. The people in the stores he bought from always knew him. And I remember once in New York that, I forget the salesman's name, but anyway, he would take the ties off the rack and take them outside so Dad could see what the color was and how it looked. His underwear would be immaculate with the t-shirts, not the t-shirts, the top, the underwear top would match his pants, his undershorts. And he was very fastidious.
He enjoyed his drinking buddies too, didn't he?
Yeah, he liked to drink. He used to smoke a lot of cigars. In his own way, he was religious. I mean, when my sister and I started to get a little older, we used to always have dinner at home Friday nights. We'd make the kiddush.
Did he go to shul every Shabbos?
Dad? Yeah, I would say he went to shul. In those days, too, remember, he used to go to walk with her grandfather.
Right, on Friday nights.
And Friday nights.
And Saturday morning.
And Saturday morning, and I bet she even Saturday nights.
And did you go with him?
Not always, no.
So, when you were growing up, did Bubby give you a lot of responsibility with your brother and sister?
No, not really.
Did she depend on you?
I don't really think so.
No.
I don't really think so.
Okay. Sumi told me some cute stories about Dee Dee. That, well, first of all, she talked about him being exceptionally good with numbers.
Oh, yeah. I'd say my father was one of the smartest business people I knew. Our company could never have grown the way it did if it wouldn't have been for Dee Dee. He got us in the pipe business by accident. He used to turn around and walk. In those days when you had a rejection of a car, you always went in to see what the rejection was. And he's walking into the mill yard and he happens to see a pile of pipe. And he says, well, what do you do with the pipe? And the purchasing agent says, we cut it up for scrap. And Dad didn't really know what a pipe was, if you know what I mean. And at that time, I think scrap was selling for $20 a ton. And Dad said to the millman, I'll give you $30 a ton. And the millman said, sure. And that's how we got into the pipe business. And I'm going back, a long, long time ago. But that's how we got into the pipe business.
And he never had a formal education, did he?
No. I don't think Dad passed public school. But he had the street smarts. And by the way, he used to play the piano by ear.
Yeah, that's right. I heard that. And he was very good with math.
Oh, very good with figures. Very good with figures. I used to love to eat peanuts. When we used to go to the football game or the wrestling match, always would buy the peanuts in the shell. In fact, some people called them peanuts.
He wasn't physically athletic, though, was he?
Not really.
Bubby was more like that.
Yeah. No, Dee Dee was lazy when it came to sports like that. But he was so. But mind you, he used to play baseball. I mean, you know, in shul, whatever it was.
Yeah. Yeah. Stories about. He would stay after work at 5 o'clock and have friends over and play cards and have a drink, right? I mean, is that what they did? There was a whole culture around the office, wasn't there?
Yeah, well, they were very informal. I mean, even when Dad used to call on the people in Toronto, they'd always end up playing gin rummy. He would come home maybe 10 o'clock at night. He loved his gin rummy, but that, I think, was his form of relaxation because he worked so hard.
Okay. Do you remember a story about? We're going to talk about you a bit. Do you remember a story about you and Belle and about calling the police on Belle?
Oh, yeah. We had a very good friend of ours, Dad and myself, a chap by the name of Fred Lowe. He was from England. Anyway, we started to deal with him on a commodity called zinc ash. Anyway, a long story short, Fred and I became very friendly, and he went into partnership in Milwaukee with a friend of ours, Judd Post. And anyway, make a long story short, Fred would always tell me where he was going, California, and he mentioned to me once that he was going to California and he was taking a girl with him. And he was only going to be there for the weekend, and he was flying back to Toronto. So I was a little bit of a devil, and I was very friendly at that time with a policeman called Ed Skolinski, motorcycle cop. And Fred said, Marvin, I'm coming in, let's say Tuesday at noon. And I arranged for one of our drivers to pick him up. But I told the driver, his name was Ray at that time, I said, whatever you do, that was before the QE was built, you had to come back through Burlington. And I says, there's a rendezvous, a place where you stop for coffee. I says, Ray, whatever you do, don't get there before, let's say, 1 o'clock. Ray said, okay. So I get a hold of my friend Skolinski, and I tell him the story, and I said, I want you to pick him up and tell him he's under arrest for the Mann Act. That's taking a girl from one state to another. Ed said, okay. I went to the Y, and I knew Ed, I knew that they should be back in Hamilton by 2 o'clock. We were on Robert Street then, and I sneak in the back way, and I get on the phone. Belle, is Fred here? Yeah, and he's here with Skolinski. I said, well, don't let on, I'm here. And I have somebody bring in my lunch. In the meantime, they're in the hall, sitting down, Skolinski and Fred Lowe. And it must have been in the summertime. Fred is sweating like a pig. And finally, Belle calls me up. She says, Marvin, you better see him. I mean, this man's panicking. I said, send him down. And Ned Skolinski was about 6 foot, and he's got the motorcycle thing with the gun in the holster. And he comes in, and he says, Mr. Goblat? I says, yeah. He says, do you know this gentleman? I said, officer, what's the matter? He said, well, you're here on a very serious charge. I says, I don't know this guy at all. Fred takes out his handkerchief, and he's screaming at me. And finally, Skolinski says, Marvin, I can't go on with this anymore. And Fred hears that. He says, you son of a bitch. I'll never forget that. That was one of many stories.
Okay, I was referring to the story when you and Belle were having a tiff, and you said, I'm going to get even with you, and you had Ed Skolinski come in with handcuffs and take her outside into his police car.
I don't remember that.
You don't?
No.
Okay. Judd Post.
Yeah.
He was a good friend of yours and Dee Dee's, right?
Yeah.
And did you used to go away with them to Europe, or?
No. What happened was Dee Dee was 13 years older than Judd.
Yeah.
And I was 13 years younger than Judd. Dad did a lot of business with Judd. He used to bring boatloads of borings, turnings and borings into Hamilton by ship. And there's a very unusual relationship between Dad and Juddy. When we got into the export business, Juddy and I became very friendly. And it was an unusual relationship that Judd, being 13 years younger than Dad and 13 years older than I was, that when we would travel together, we used to go to Europe. Dad used to go to Europe with me once a year. And Juddy would go with us because Jetty was a good guy and we had a good relationship with him. And the three of us got along. You wouldn't believe that we were a friend and a son, and we would have a ball.
What would you do over there in Europe?
We were selling scrap at that time to the common market. That was a OCCF. It was the buying after the war. The Europeans got together like they have now with the Commonwealth thing, and the headquarters for buying scrap was in Brussels. And you sold scrap to the Brussels office, who then designated it to the countries, Italy, France, and England was excluded, but it was England, Germany, Italy, and France. So like I say, that was my first big job, was in the export business. Dad got into it with a friend called Richard Nathan, and I was sent over there to learn the export business. I think my first trip had to be in 47, 48.
Do you need to take a break before we go into other parts of this story?
Well, now, how long can you...
Well, this could go on for days. So, because I want to talk to you about Mummy.
Yeah.
Maybe we should leave that for another day or after lunch, because that could get you into a whole other good half hour of talking, and I don't want to tire you out.
You want to have some soup?
No, but I'll watch you have some soup.
Where's Romana?
Okay, I'm ready. I'm shooting. Okay, so we did part 1 and we did part 2. Actually, we did Dee Dee and we did Jacob. We did a little bit of Bubby Dolly, and now I want to ask you about Mummy.
Right.
All right, so tell me, when did you, tell me the whole story in as much detail as you can remember, how you and Mummy met.
I came back from Buffalo one night. Oh God, it's got to be 52, at least 52 years ago. I went with Bernie Frankel, who was approximately my age, and Sammy Nyman, a guy that used to work for The Spectator. And I come home after celebrating, carousing in Buffalo, and I got home about 3 in the morning, and my mother meets me downstairs and gives me shit. And she said, "Your dad is angry at you, and if you're not in the office by either 7 or 8 o'clock in the morning, you're not to come back to work. You're fired." And he means it. I'm just saying, if it was 52 years ago, I had to be 24, 25, approximately. I'm not quite sure. Anyway, make a long story short, 7 o'clock. At that time, we were living in John Street. Mother comes into my bedroom and she says, "You heard what I said last night. Your dad is really upset with you. And if you're not in the office by 8 o'clock, you're in for big trouble." I go to get out of bed, and I can't. I got a very, very bad pain in my right-hand side. And Mother starts to yell at me, "This is what happens when you get drunk," and all of that. Anyway, I try to get out of bed, and I can't, and I'm in great pain. And to make a long story short, at that time, the doctors made house calls. Dr. Pakin lived around the corner on Barton Street, and he was their family doctor. He comes over and he takes one look at me and feels my side, and he says, "This guy's got an appendicitis." They rushed me to the hospital right away. It was on the General Hospital, still there on Barton Street. They take me in, and naturally Dad's upset. And it was lucky that they did it when they did, because otherwise I was ready to burst and I could have had peritonitis. Naturally, my dad feels badly about it, and after about a week, he says, "You better go to Florida. I'm going to send you to Florida, but I'm not sending you alone." He didn't trust me. And he sends me with his good friend Barney Hirschman. Barney Hirschman had been the same age as Dad, and they were very good buddies. And that's how I went to Florida. I was supposed to stay at a hotel called, I think it was the White House, that Dad and Mother always spent their vacations on. And we got there about 11 o'clock in the morning, and my room isn't ready. And I started to yell and shout and scream to no avail. And I go across the road, there's another hotel. I can't think of the name, I wished I could. Anyway, I go across the road and I want to get a room there. And they didn't have any rooms, they said. As I'm ready to leave, Bernie Ziff Sr. was staying there. And he knew the owner of the hotel. And he asked me, what am I doing? I'm telling him the story. He says, don't worry. Goes to the desk, gets me a room. I come down to the pool about 1 o'clock, and I see 2 women there. Not bad looking. And I'm kibitzing around, and one of them is diving from the top board. That happened to be Mummy. And she's with her sister-in-law, Irene. Anyway, I'm looking at them, and then in those days in the hotel, bookies would come along and take a bet on the horses. Barney was a big, big gambler, knew his way around, and the bookie comes over and he says, who do you like? And naturally, I see these 2 girls, I walk over to them and I say, pick a horse, pick a name. And that's how I met him. I was going to take him out that night, but they went out for dinner alone. They come back to the bar about 10 o'clock, 11 o'clock. I told them I'd meet them for a drink. And it was a funny thing. Another guy is sitting at the bar. He tries to pick him up. I go crazy. You nearly have a fight. The bartender jumps over. He liked me. Anyway, nothing really happened. The next day, I think it was the next day, I was kibitzing with him, I guess, by the pool. And then my dad loved clothes and jewelry and all of that. And he had asked me to pick up a pair of cufflinks at the Roni Plaza Hotel in Miami. So I happened to say to Lillian, I says, Lillian, I have to go downtown to pick something up for Dad. Do you want to come along? And she said yes. Anyway, the cufflinks had to be about $35. In those days, $35 was a lot of money. And for some ungodly reason, I didn't have the money. So I said to Lil, I says, Lil, can you loan me $50? She loans me the $50, and then I pay for it, and then on the way back, I could see she's got a crazy look on her, not a crazy look, a look of astonishment or something, and I found out later, she was saying to herself this was the last $50 she had. She just met this kooky guy, never taken her out or anything, and before I know it, she gave me the $50. She was plenty worried. Well, P.S. I gave her back the 50. And we started to go out nearly every night. I think she was there for a week, and I think I was only there for, well, maybe a little longer than a week, and I was there for maximum a week, and we saw a lot of each other.
I heard that she was only supposed to be there for a week, but she ended up staying 3.
Well, that I don't know. I don't remember that because I wasn't there for 3 weeks.
No way?
No. Anyway, one thing led to another. We grew very attached, and I had left, and I would call her nearly every night. She was married at the time to Manny and just had a baby, Michael Sue. And
you called her where every night? At her house with Manny?
Yeah, we had a certain hour, whatever it was. And one thing led to another that finally she decided to leave Manny. I'll never forget, she called me up one morning at the office and she said, I've left Manny. Well, to be honest with you, I was kind of shocked and surprised. And she could tell in her voice that I was, surprised. Anyway, she said, look, I don't want to hold you to anything, that I was not happy with Manny. And by the way, she never spoke badly about Manny at any time. She spoke with respect. They just couldn't get along. Anyway, I said, no, it's all right and all of that. And then I didn't call her for a while after that. Maybe I was chicken. And she called me, and I said, okay, I'd like to meet you in New York. And she came up to New York, and I just came in for the day. And we took a walk in Central Park and all of that. And I would leave New York at 4 o'clock in the afternoon, and she would then take the train back to Philadelphia. And this kept on, I'll bet you, for a good 3 or 4 months, that every Saturday morning, whatever it was, I'd get up, I'd catch a plane and all of that. And then, at that time, I had a girlfriend in Hamilton, non-Jewish girl. Her name was Helen Percy. And I was a real prick, I guess, because after I would leave Lil, I would come to Hamilton and take out Helen. And I happened to tell Mother about it. Well, needless to say, Mother went hairy. And she gave me an ultimatum. I'll never forget, it was a Saturday afternoon. And the ultimatum was that either I give up Helen or forget her. I get back to Hamilton at 6 o'clock. I'll never forget that Saturday night, and I have a date with Helen. And we used to go out for dinner every Saturday night to the Royal Canard Hotel in the main dining room. And I knew the head waiter. His name, by the way, was Tommy. And this particular Saturday night, I says, Tommy, I want a quiet table in the corner. Anyway, make a long story short, I told Helen it was all over and all of that. And then Lil wanted to meet Mother, but the first person she met was Dad. Dad used to go to New York quite often, and Lil came over one Saturday, and we went to a restaurant called Hutton's. It was right near the Grand Central Station at that time, and Dad always used to have his dinner there at nights. And Lil came over, and the first one she met was Dad. And Dad liked her right away. I don't know if she brought her mother with her at the time or not, but anyway, that wasn't important. And then she wanted to meet Mother, and I imagine, so long ago, that I think Mother, Dad, and I maybe Sorry.
Sorry. It was Mommy, but Dolly and Sorry.
Yeah. Met in New York, and Lil was scared shitless. Anyway, everything went fine.
Dolly said she came with all black, and she was wearing a black veil.
Who was?
Mommy.
Yeah, she could be. I used to like black, as it happens. Anyway, they hit it off well. And then what happened was something unusual. They were dedicating the Jacob Goldblatt Community Center building. At that time, it was on Delaware Avenue. And I'll never forget, Lil came in for it. And Lil was in the midst of getting a divorce. Our lawyer was a guy called Verdon. A hell of a nice guy who, by the way, became very, very friendly with us. And we're in Hamilton for the opening, had to be on a Sunday. And Lil gets a phone call from a supposedly friend of hers. I forget the friend's name now. Anyway, and said, Lil, you're being blackmailed and all of that, and you have to come up with so much money, otherwise they're going to turn around and tell Manny, whatever the case may be. Lil goes back. We get a hold of our lawyer, and he says right away, it smells. It looks like it's blackmail. I don't know why I can't think of this girl's name. Anyway, and this was a very good friend of Lil's, as it happened, she thought. Anyway, to make a long story short, Lil goes back, and she gets a phone call at about 10 or 11 o'clock at night. And then as Lil is talking to this girl, Lil says, I know who was behind it. It's you. You are the one that is blackmailing me. Anyway, the girl doesn't want to hang up. Lil had called me, and she leaves the house because the girl wouldn't hang up. She calls me from a payphone to tell me all about it. It's now 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning. Anyway, we get a hold of our lawyer again, and things worked out. There was no particular problem. And then we got married. We got married, I think it was in April, if I'm not mistaken, right?
Well, how was it hard to get a divorce in those days? Did you have to have a detective or something?
Well, we hired detectives, but there was no shenanigans going on. Finally, the divorce was granted. In fact, even Lil got a Jewish get, the Jewish divorce. And not that she was religious, whatever the case may be, but I had asked her to get it, and it was done. And it worked out, ironically enough, that it was a very, very friendly divorce. In fact, it's ironic that Manny would come up periodically to visit Michael Sue. I'll never forget one particular episode. I was very friendly with a policeman called Ed Skolinski, motorcycle cop. He was about 6 foot and weighed about 180 pounds, with the motorcycle. And the first time Manny was coming over to visit us was a Saturday. I asked Ed to do me a favor to be at the house. I didn't know if he would try to abduct Michael Sue, whatever the case may be. He comes over at 12 o'clock. I think I even arranged for a car to pick up Manny. I'm not sure now. But anyway, Ed Skolinski comes in. He's sitting in our living room. Manny comes in. I introduce him. And finally, Ed gives me the signal. He says, Marvin, I don't think you need me anymore. Anyway, he left. And we had dinner together at our house. And he left. And he would come up periodically. In fact, I'll never forget one particular time he came up. We were skiing at Chicopee, which is right near Kitchener, when we first started off to learn how to ski. Manny was up that particular weekend. Lil has a bad fall, and she has to go in to the emergency to have her ankle taped. Manny and I carried her in. So the point I'm getting at is, it was a very, very friendly breakup. There's no bad feelings. We did it for a lot of reasons, because of Michael Sue and the other kids. So anyway, that was that as far as it went.
How long did the courtship last before you actually got married, between the time you met her and the time you got married?
That's a good question, Wendy. Maybe 2 years.
Well, how old was Michael Sue when she
No, Michael Sue was about a year. Michael Sue was very young. 2 years, maybe? I don't know
I
now.
heard Michael Sue was only 6 weeks old when she met you.
Yeah, Michael Sue was that young. And 2 years, I'll bet you,
A
yeah.
couple years.
And then when we got married, I'll never forget, we got married on a Saturday afternoon. We got married in Toronto, as it happens, at the Royal York Hotel. But before that, I got Lil a corsage, an orchid. I wanted a black orchid. And at that time, we bought it from Kaufman's, had a florist in Hamilton. And they had to take the white orchid and paint it black for me. Anyway, it takes a long time, and Lil and I have a fight. This is the wedding day, I'll never forget. And Lil's upset, And my mother, I'll never forget, said, "It's a good sign if you cry on your wedding day." Anyway, we get to the hotel for the wedding. It was going to be about 5 o'clock. It was supposed to be a very, very small wedding. When we get there, the head maitre d' at that time was a guy called Lawrence. I'll never forget that. And he shows us the room that we're going to have for the party. And Jesus, it'll hold another 50 or 100 people. Mother gets on the phone. We must have called 50 people between 5 and 7 o'clock that afternoon. Lou Davidson, Alan Sway, people like that, and surprisingly, they all came. We were going to Honolulu at the time for our wedding, for our honeymoon, and in those days it was hard to get American money. You had to have a document from the bank, and I was only allowed to take out, let's say, $500, but my dad and I were very friendly with Judd Post, and we had called up Juddy, and Juddy was to meet us in Chicago and give us extra money. We met Juddy in Chicago. By the way, I got drunk on my wedding night. We had a compartment, and they rolled me in. I think I slept in the top bunk, and Mother slept in the bottom. Anyway, we get the money, and we're taking a boat trip to Honolulu, to Hawaii. And on the boat trip, there was a veterinarian convention. And we got friendly with a few of the veterinarians, nice young people. And like I said, Lil liked the water and diving, and she used to wear falsies. And she's diving, and all of a sudden, one of the falsies came off and is floating on the water. Mother was so embarrassed, you can't believe it. And right away, she runs out of the pool and changes into another bathing suit and comes back, and like nothing happened. Anyway, we spent the honeymoon in Honolulu. And then we came back, and at that time, I had bought a house, but Lil had okayed it, 45 St. James Place, and we did an awful lot of decorating. And that was the story there. Lil was very fond of all types of sports. She got involved in golfing, and whenever she got involved in it, she really put her heart and soul in it. She got me involved in appreciating operas. I'll never forget that on our trips to New York, we would spend nearly every Saturday night when we were there, we usually go to an opera. She introduced me to Puccini, who's my favorite opera writer, or whatever it is, composer. And that was that part of it. She took up skiing, golfing, and then she was a great animal lover. I'll never forget, once I went out and I bought a dog. I think Beverly had been born by that time now. I don't know if Janet was there, born at the time. Anyway, I bought a dog, a boxer. I brought the dog home, and did I get shit? Oh, I'll never forget it. She really said, no, you should have told me about it. And anyway, I think I kept the dog for about 1 hour, and discretion was the greater part of valor. I took him back. Then we decided jointly on dogs, and we bought 2 German Shepherds. And Lil was very, how can I say it, attached to the dogs, and we're taking him to the dog training school.
I think, Daddy, you had collies before you had the Shepherds. You had Laddie.
I'm sorry, the collies first, yes.
Yeah.
You're right. Okay? Yeah, we had them because we used to visit you kids at camp. Oh yeah, and then, I got to get my story straight about the dogs. Okay. Then I had a boat. Lil loved the boat. without any question of a doubt. And we would take our annual summer holidays on the boat. How Lil could manage space is unbelievable. All of our food was prepared before, and we took it on the boat. We used to go on our boat trips with Marty Dorfman, and we took some big trips. We used to visit the kids at camp, and from there we used to go up to Georgian Bay, and none of us really had any navigational experience, but between us we were able to manage, and we were in pretty rough waters, and we've had a lot of good adventures, and we never ate out. We always ate on the boat. We had a rule that we would hit anchorage about 4 or 5 o'clock in the afternoon, anchored always out in the water, never on shore. And then we'd have our happy hour, which was about 6 or 7 o'clock. But in the meantime, we had anchored. Mother did most of the heating up and preparing of the food. Marion would help. And the boat wasn't that big. It was a 27-footer with 4 people living on it. But we ate royally. Mother was not scared of anything. In fact, we once took a boat trip to Expo in Montreal. We went with Marty Dorfman at that time, all by ourselves without any navigational experience. And we get there after about, it took us I think 2.5, 3 days. We picked the boat up at Kingston not to waste time with the locks. We had a berth reserved for us at Expo, and like I say, we really enjoyed it and all of that. Anyway, coming back, Marty gets a phone call that his father was very ill and he had to leave. And Lil and I came back all by ourselves. And it was remarkable how we managed it. Unbelievable. Not having that great experience, and how we both had to work in concert. Driving the boat is very easy, but it's when you dock and have to get out and drop anchor. Anyway, we came all the way back to the cottage. In fact, I have a picture in my den up north, and you may have remembered it, Wendy, Mother bending over. That was when we came back. And Marty met us here and gave Mother a bouquet of flowers, whatever it was. So we had an awful lot of good trips in that respect there. We went to Puerto Rico. We chartered a sailboat, just Lil and I, with a crew, of course. We had a crew of 2. Then, I must tell you the episode, we bought 2 shepherds after Molly died, when Carly's died. And I'll never forget this, how honest and devoted Mother was. We're training the dogs at one of the centers. It was a real wintry night. I mean, real bad storm. And we're down at one of the shopping malls. I think it was the Center Mall. And we're training our dogs after the lesson, whatever it was. And one of the lessons were you take your leash off the dog and you make him come and stay. Lil undid the dog she was doing. I think it was Casey or Damon, I'm not sure now. Anyway, to make a long story short, car comes along and honks the horn. The dog gets scared and runs away. And this is about 9, 10 o'clock at night. And we started to look for the dog. Anyway, we can't find it. And I forced Lil, literally forced her in the car. I said, "You're crazy. What the fuck are you doing?" No, she wanted to find it. Anyway, she called up she called the Humane Society to alert them. Anyway, she gets so upset that she couldn't find the dog. She leaves the house. I don't know if she took the car or took a taxi, where it was. And she finally found the dog at 3 in the morning. In that storm, unbelievable. So she was that devoted and all of that. We used to have our own horses. We rode a lot. We went, if it wouldn't be for her, I don't think I wouldn't have had the summer the cottages. I bought the cottage, and we spent time here, and I didn't really want to winterize it, and she forced me into it, and I'm not sorry about it now. And then when our kids got older, I always said to her, I don't want the kids to live in the cottage with us. I said, we're grandparents, but we're not going to become parents. And Lil agreed with me to a great extent. And then when the other cottages came along, at her encouragement, we bought it, and the first one was the Florence cottage. We bought that. The 3 kids were supposed to live in it. And then the first year they're there, we had to call the police and the army because everybody was fighting. Anyway, what happened after that, we bought another cottage, and things boiled down to it. Lil did not come from a religious family at all, but she fitted in remarkably well considering her background with the Friday night dinners and the holidays, particularly after my dad died and mother came home. We used to have breaking the fast at our house and the Passover, etc., etc. As you can imagine, I wasn't the easiest person to live with. We had our differences, but we had some type of a bonding that you couldn't explain. I'll never forget one particular instance, and I know I'm wandering with time, but Mother had a disease called Guillain-Barré, which is paralysis. And she was in the hospital, I'll bet you, for over a month. And she was up at the mountain. And I used to see her every day. And naturally, I had nurses for her around the clock. And this particular day, I went up about 4 or 5 o'clock. I like to get there at that hour because that's when her nurse would turn around and go for her supper hour. And I'll never forget, I got there at 4:30, 5 o'clock, and the nurse said to me that, she says, Marvin lives in a very, very depressed state. Anyway, I go in, and Lil wasn't able to walk. She took her in a wheelchair out to the garden. The hospital was situated in a nice spot. There had lots of grounds. Anyway, I'm taking Lil for a ride in the wheelchair, and all of a sudden we stop and we're talking, and she says, I want a divorce. And I look at her, I says, well, what the fuck's the matter? She says, no, I want a divorce. I says, what's the matter? And she said that the doctor had told her, it was an intern, had told her that afternoon that she'd never walk again, that she'd be in a wheelchair for the rest of her life. Well, naturally, I was very upset, and I said, bullshit. Because I had noticed, ironically, every time I saw Mother, I noticed a sincere improvement without any question of a doubt, with no bullshit. And I told her, and I know the first time they put her in the water, in the pool in the hospital, the nurse called me and said that they were going to put her in the pool at 1:30 and that they'd like me to be there. And they put her in the pool with a harness, like you do with a horse, lowered. Anyway, and even with the walker. And I had called, anyway, after that episode about the being a cripple for the rest of her life, I called up and I spoke to the senior doctor, whatever it was, and I told him, I said, this intern ought to be fucking shot. Anyway, it was rectified in this way here, that they're able to satisfy Lil that the guy was stupid, that there was no question or no particular reason why they would have to turn around and she would have to be a cripple. So she gets better from there. Mother was a great lover of flowers, as you know. And when she had Guillain-Barré, there were two things she said she specifically wanted. She wanted a Jag, and she wanted a greenhouse. So I made a deal with her. I says, Lil, when you come home, I promise you'll get the Jag and you'll get the greenhouse. Fortunately, she got the Jag and the greenhouse, and our house is always, we had more fucking flowers than I think a florist has. But anyway, she loved them, she took care of them, and our garden grew according to her wishes and all of that. After that, I'm just trying to think of this particular episode. Yes, it was when she also had Guillain-Barré. She was on a respirator, and they had to give her a tracheotomy. The first hospital she went to was in London, because Dr. Bill Goldberg at that time, when she saw this, what was happening, it happened on the weekend. We're up north. I'll never forget that. Mother felt lousy, and Beverly was over here that particular Sunday, and Mother really felt shitty. We went back Monday morning, and in fact, Sorry came over. I was in the office, and they went over to see Bill Goldberg, and that was when Bill was concerned about her and didn't know what it was, and they sent her to a hospital in London, Ontario. And again, I used to go every day to see her, but what was so ironic about it was that Mother always complained she had an awful lot of pain, and they never knew what it was. Anyway, a long story short, the head nurse at that time at the London hospital was a male nurse, and he didn't believe in giving Mother too much morphine, I think it was, not morphine, whatever it was. And Lil would complain. In fact, she couldn't get out of bed. She had to roll over, and the nurses had to pick her up and put her down, whatever the case may be. Anyway, she would always turn around and say, Marvin, let them give me something for my pain. And I was stupid. I spoke to the male nurse, and he says, no, he's afraid that she would become addicted. And when I told Mother that, Mother says, bullshit, at my age. Anyway, I didn't use my head. I listened to the male nurse, and Mother had to grin and bear it with the pain. Anyway, they released her from the hospital because they didn't know what the hell was the matter with her. She could bring her back to Hamilton, to the hospital there. And it was a Friday she got back. Saturday morning at 3 in the morning, I get a phone call from the hospital that she couldn't breathe, and they wanted to do a tracheotomy. And naturally, I said yes. The hospital was only a 5-minute walk from the house. I go over, and they did the tracheotomy, and she's on the respirator. And you can imagine how frustrated it is that she couldn't speak, but she was able to say things, and if I couldn't understand her, she'd get very upset, as you can imagine. And I finally bought her a board with the initials A to Z, with the pointer and all of that. But one particular day, the chap in charge of the respirator, the doctor, was a doctor called Dr. Morse, as it happens. And ironically, he lived on Aberdeen. And he was the doctor in charge of the respiratory thing. And I'll never forget that he was visiting her one particular day when I was there, and Lil was trying to tell him something, and he had to bend down his ear, and I remember him saying, he says, Lil, you're not going to die. So I said to him, I says, Doctor, what caused this? And she had whispered to him, I'm not ready to die yet. And that was her answer. Lil was a fighter. Through Bill Goldberg, they decided to give her a plasmapheresis, whatever it was. And I was at the Y at that lunch hour, and I got a phone call from Billy Goldberg, and he wanted to see me right away, so I went over, and he says, Marvin, I'd like to try this. Anyway, I says, okay, but we had to get Lil's permission. I go over to see Lil with Ben Finkelstein, And all I had is, and Lil couldn't speak at the time. I says, Lil, they want to try this plasmapheresis, whatever it is. What do you say? And without batting an eyelash, bingo. Unfortunately, from then on, she got better. The ironic part of that story is that when she got cancer, I'll never forget, we had to get some tests taken in that case too. This also was a Friday at the St. Joseph's Hospital. At the maternity hospital, there's another area that they had, and Bill sent us over for certain tests that we had to get because, again, they didn't know what it was. Anyway, the test was at 10, 11 o'clock in the morning. I'll never forget, it took an hour and a half. And then the person taking the x-rays turned around and said, Dr. Goldberg would like to see you. And we were walking over there because it wasn't far to his office, and Lil said, I'll bet you I got cancer. I says, bullshit. We walked over. We get to Billy's office about 1:30. He had somebody in there, and then he saw us at 2 o'clock. And then he says, Lil, you've got cancer. And the first thing Mother said was, how long do I have? Which is the normal question. Well, it's hard to tell. You can live for 10 years, and Lil looks at him, and she says, Billy, don't bullshit me. She didn't use those words. And he said, look, it really asked me a difficult question. Could be a year, it could be 2 years, it could be 10 years. Anyway, I said to Lil, we won't go up north. Oh, she insisted on coming up, and we came up, and in those days, I think I was driving myself, and we don't say much about it. We get here, and she asked me not to tell the kids about it. Anyway, I went over and I told Beverly and Jackie. And then that night, we were going out for dinner in Barrie with Robert and Janet, and she forbade me to tell them about it. Anyway, that's what happened. And then the ironic part about it was that when the end came, and she turned around to Mark Levine, and she says, now I'm ready to die. And that was it. She was very loyal with her friends, unbelievably so. Even the people that she wasn't fond of, she never had a bad word about them. Her friendship was unbelievable. She loved to ski, as the family knows, and horseback ride. I'll never forget that she was supposed to go out skiing in Aspen and stay with Ken and Lola this particular weekend. She was leaving. And that was when Dad was very ill. And anyway, I had just left Dad. I was very upset. I'll never forget. It was a Saturday or a Sunday morning, whatever it was. And then I broke down, and then she canceled her trip. So basically, I mean, I think that's all it is.
Just wait a minute.
Yep.
Tell me about when, couple of days before she died, she had basically said goodbye to everybody and said, this is it, I'm going to die tonight. And everyone left. And she didn't really want to see anybody. And that night she called you in the middle of the night.
Go on, yeah.
Very mad because she wasn't dead yet.
Yeah,
and
that's
you
right.
had to calm her down. Can you talk about that? Do you remember that story?
Yeah.
It was like 2
I
in the
think
morning.
Lil died about on a Wednesday, I think. It had to be a Wednesday, and the funeral was Thursday, I think.
I think the funeral was Friday. I think she died on Thursday.
Thursday could be.
This was, I think, on
Wednesday night.
Tuesday.
All right, Tuesday night, Lil had been taking a lot of tests and blood transfusions, and then it wasn't working out. And anyway, Mike Levine was over. came over, and that was when he told Lil and I that it had hit the liver and that it was just a question of time. And Lil said to Mark, she says, Mark, I want you to promise me one thing, that you won't let me suffer. And that she said, I don't want to be put, if anything, because he said one of the things could be that she could go into a coma. And she said, if that happens, I don't want to be resuscitated. I want to go. And he promises her that. It's about 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning. I get a phone call from Lil from the hospital. I'm not dead. How come I'm not dead? Mark said I was going to be dead. And after about 20 minutes, I was able to calm her down and explain to her what really had transpired. It's ironic that after that phone call, I think, Wendy, you said it was a Tuesday. I think you're right, because when I went over to the hospital on Wednesday, I think that was the day Bubby came over to see her. Frances, our old cook, came over there. She wanted to see her. And then Lil was talking. The grandchildren were all there. And Lil was very, very lucid. And I really felt that Lil had it beat. I really believed it, because she spoke to Jeremy. She spoke to all of the kids. In fact, she even said to me, Marvin, I used to bug her. There was a parcel from Burke's in the hall cupboard. And I would see it when I used to put my clothes there. And I kept on saying to Lil, what is it? And she would say, it's none of your business. I said, I'm going to get rid of it. Don't you dare. It's none of your business. Wednesday, she turned around and said, Marvin, you know that thing you found there? That was for Janet. And she says, now you can give it to her. In fact, I forget what it was. It was something.
Cutlery or dishes.
Yeah, something, whatever it was.
Yeah.
But that's what I'm saying. I would have bet anything that was it. But if death can be pleasant, or not pleasant, if death can be serene and meaningful, I think it was her death, because all of the girls were there. And that was it. Next question.
Okay. She was very active in theater.
Yeah, very.
How many years did that go on? Do you remember when she was the lead in all those plays?
Oh, Wendy, honest to God, I don't know. It was a long time, I know.
And did she really loved it?
Yep. Yes, she did.
And did you didn't mind?
Well, no, because she enjoyed it.
Yeah.
And, you know, I was busy periodically with trips, whatever it was, and this was a time for her not to be left alone often.
Okay, so now the question that everybody in the family wants to know is, why did she stop?
I don't remember. Maybe because she was getting older. I honestly don't remember now, Wendy.
Because it was something she loved.
Yeah.
And
but what came on after that? Because most of the things she did was for the shul.
Yeah.
Okay, she was never involved in anything outside of the shul, the plays, as far as the plays were concerned.
So she never did like Players Guild or anything like that?
No. So I think I think it stopped because maybe the synagogue stopped doing it. That's the only explanation I can offer.
All right. The other thing is, you know, when everybody left home,
yeah,
you know, or when I was like the last kid at home, I often said to her, you know, Mommy, why don't you take a course at the university or something? Because I got the feeling that she was bored, that she needed something in her life, and she never did. Like I felt that she didn't have anything really to call her own in those later years when she had so much free time. Like, why didn't she pursue something?
Well, I'll tell you, Wendy, I mean, where I disagree is this way here. She had her sports, she had her golf, her tennis. We used to travel a fair bit. She had her friends with Lola. She had her friends with Rita Priest. And she would go shopping with them, not for clothes, but for the art. You've seen some of the art we've had there. And I guess that must have kept her busy. I don't know. I never noticed the boredom that you mentioned.
Okay. Well, then that's okay. All right.
Okay?
Yeah, so that's about it, I guess.
Yeah,
All right. I'm going to say goodbye now.
yeah.
Okay. Photography.
Yeah, okay. I forgot to mention that Mother really loved doing photography. Even in the city house, I have pictures of the photography she did. Up at the cottage, I have a lot of pictures that she had taken that we had framed. And when we used to take our travels, she always took a camera. We spent time, and if it really wouldn't have been for Lil, I don't think I would have gone to these exotic places. Particularly, we talk about being in Africa on safaris, and where we really roughed it. And Lil certainly was able to adapt herself, being in the jungle or being in any formal affairs. We had entertained at our home Leah Rabin. We had an affair for the ambassador from Israel to Canada. I think his name was Herzog, where we had a gala ball. And after the gala ball, we had a few people over to our city house. So she was able to adapt in all aspects. Okay, I think that's it now.